The HOA padlocked Owen's private dock and slapped him with $3,000 in fines, claiming his boat lift disrupted shoreline harmony. Behind it all were Robert and Sheila, board members quietly pushing a redevelopment plan that targeted retirees. But Owen was no ordinary homeowner. He turned his dock into a drawbridge the HOA had to pay to use. And just wait until you hear how he made them sign a contract for it, and why justice in the end came sailing in. When Owen Callahan retired from the Coast Guard after 28 years of service, he wasn't looking for excitement. He'd had plenty of that already. What he wanted was silence, salt air, a quiet place to restore the old wooden sailboat he'd inherited from his father, and maybe take her out on the water once or twice a week. So, when he found a modest but charming waterfront property in the Seagrass Shores HOA community on Florida's Gulf Coast, he thought he'd struck gold. The house needed a little work, but the dock was solid, and the slip was perfect for his boat, Ruby. He had the lift installed within the first week, not some eyesore contraption, but a clean, functional setup designed to keep the hull dry and safe from barnacles and tide surge. Everything was by the book. Permits were pulled, approved, and finalized. Owen even went out of his way to ensure the lift met the HOA's aesthetic guidelines: white vinyl siding on the posts, low-profile arms, minimal visual obstruction from the path. For 3 weeks, it was peaceful. Then came the envelope. It wasn't a warning or a courtesy note. It was a notice of violation from the Seagrass Shores HOA Compliance Office, printed in bold red across the top. The letter claimed his boat lift was visually disruptive to the community shoreline harmony and in conflict with Section 14C of the Architectural Standards. The penalty, $500 per day until full removal. Owen read the letter twice, then a third time. Section 14. C didn't exist, not in any of the documents he'd been given. He went digging. There was no mention of boat lifts anywhere in the bylaws. No restrictions on dock modifications beyond height limits and lighting colors. He'd followed every rule they had. Confused, Owen decided to clear things up in person at the HOA office. But when he arrived, the front desk receptionist told him the board didn't take walk-ins. "You'll need to submit your concerns in writing," she said with a rehearsed smile. "Processing time is 6 to 8 weeks." The next morning, Owen was on his deck drinking coffee when he heard footsteps on the dock. He turned to see 2 people, strangers at first, snapping pictures with their phones. One of them was an older man in slacks and a golf polo, the other a woman in oversized sunglasses and wedge sandals. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't ask permission. They just kept circling the boat lift like they were preparing to list it on a real estate website. Owen stepped forward. "Can I help you?" The man lowered his phone. "Robert Crane, HOA board president. This is Sheila Marks, our vice chair." He gestured lazily toward the boat lift. "This thing wasn't approved by the board. You're in violation." "I have county permits," Owen replied, keeping his voice calm. "Everything was cleared before installation." Sheila rolled her eyes. "County doesn't matter here. This is Seagrass Shores. You don't just do whatever you want." Then came the threat, blunt and unapologetic. "Failure to comply will result in a daily fine of $500, Robert said. "We're starting today." They walked off without another word. By the end of the week, Owen's dock gate was padlocked shut with a steel chain. Not by him. A contractor hired by the HOA had come while he was out, installed temporary fencing along the path, and secured the gate from the community side, claiming a temporary compliance restriction zone was necessary for investigation. There was a laminated sign stapled to the railing. "Access restricted. Ongoing review by HOA Enforcement Committee." Owen stood at the top of his own dock, staring at the lock on a gate he built and paid for. His boat hung motionless above the water, cradled in the lift. He couldn't even step down to check her hull. It was his dock, his property. But someone else held the key. And for the first time since leaving the Coast Guard, Owen felt like he was back under hostile command. Except this time it wasn't from enemy waters. It was from a neighborhood board armed with clipboards and bylaws they didn't even bother to follow. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't file a complaint. He just went back inside and started a folder. Owen didn't sleep much after the gate was locked. Instead, he stayed up late at his kitchen table, documents spread out like nautical charts. His Coast Guard years had taught him the value of meticulous paperwork and reading the fine print. And if there was one thing he trusted more than wind direction, it was patterns. The Seagrass Shores HOA bylaws weren't just vague, they were suspiciously fluid. Sections had been rewritten recently, but without homeowner votes or official meeting minutes posted. What began as curiosity quickly turned into a quiet obsession. He requested old versions of the governing documents from the county records office and compared them page by page to the HOA's current digital listings. And that's when he saw it. In the last 18 months, the board had pushed through 5 administrative amendments affecting dock access, yard boundaries, and easement rights, but only in the waterfront sections of the neighborhood. Of the 12 dock-owning residents on record, 5 had received code violations in the last year. 3 had sold their homes under pressure. The remaining 4, all over the age of 60, all retired. This wasn't random enforcement. It was a surgical campaign. Further digging revealed a document tucked deep inside a zoning proposal filed with the county. It was labeled Community Redevelopment Phase, Reservoir, Marina Expansion. The HOA board, led by Robert Crane, had submitted a plan to repurpose several private dock spaces as part of a shared access marina project. The proposal wasn't finalized yet, but the intent was crystal clear. Clear out individual dock owners, then convert the land into communal HOA-controlled space. And they were doing it quietly before the next annual vote. Suddenly, everything made sense. The arbitrary rule changes, the false citations, the selective enforcement. They weren't just coming after Owen's lift. They were trying to make his dock, and others like it, so burdensome and unusable that residents would either give up or move out. It was nothing short of a land grab masked in bureaucracy. Owen gathered the evidence into neat folders, labeled and color-coded. Photos, timelines, printed emails, copies of permits. Then, he did what any reasonable man would do. He formally requested a meeting with the HOA board to appeal his case. He showed up early in a clean polo, a binder under one arm, and every document neatly tabbed. But when he walked into the meeting room at the clubhouse, Sheila Marks didn't even look up from her phone. "We'll keep this short," she said flatly, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table. "Your appeal is denied. Your structure remains non-compliant." Owen didn't move. "I'm asking for clarification on which bylaw I violated." She finally looked at him, eyes blank, but voice tinged with condescension. "You're just one man against the rules, Mr. Callahan. You really think that's going to go well for you?" No one else at the table said a word. Owen stood, calm but cold. He nodded once, then left. That same afternoon, another envelope appeared in his mailbox. Inside, a formal notice that his fines had reached $3,000, and that the HOA had begun proceedings to place a lien on his home for non-payment. He sat in silence, reading the words slowly. But this time, there was no shock, no disbelief, only clarity. They thought he'd fold. They thought the threat would be enough. But Owen Callahan didn't spend nearly 3 decades navigating storms and war zones just to be bullied off his own dock by a couple of weekend bureaucrats with clipboards. He stared out at the boat lift through his kitchen window. The Florida sun was setting low behind Ruby, casting long shadows across the water. They had picked the wrong sailor, and they were about to find out just how wrong. Owen didn't waste his energy yelling or threatening. That wasn't his style. His years in uniform had taught him something far more valuable. When people abuse power, they often don't expect their victims to know the system better than they do. So he got to work, not with noise, but with phone calls. His first call was to the Florida State Dock Authority, where he still had contacts from his time overseeing coastal infrastructure on military contracts. His second was to the County Infrastructure Board, where he requested all easement filings and shoreline maps related to Seagrass Shores. His third call was to a local land surveyor, a no-nonsense man named Clay Winters, who had lived in the area for decades and knew the waterfront boundaries better than most lawyers. Clay met Owen at the property the next morning, rolled out his gear, and within 45 minutes had something interesting to say. "You see that fence the HOA put in behind your dock? It cuts right through your deeded access easement. They've actually trespassed onto your land." Owen raised an eyebrow. "And the locked gate?" "Completely illegal. They can't restrict access to your own dock. And what's more, the community path they installed behind your lot, they're using your property as a pass-through. That right was never granted." What the HOA had done, twisting rules, installing fences, fencing off Owen's private dock, wasn't just unethical. It was structurally and legally baseless. They had acted like kings of a territory they didn't actually control. And that was the moment something shifted. Owen didn't just want the gate removed anymore. He wanted to turn the tables. The next week, he hired a marine contractor, same one who'd installed his original boat lift. But this time the request was unconventional. Owen designed and commissioned a custom-built drawbridge-style access ramp to replace the simple gate the HOA had padlocked. Not a drawbridge in the fairy tale sense, but a modern engineered liftgate made of powder-coated steel and composite decking, rigged to pivot vertically on reinforced posts. The catch: the entire mechanism could only be lowered by turning a heavy-duty crank installed inside a weatherproof lockbox on Owen's private patio. Without the crank, the drawbridge stayed upright, completely cutting off water access to the dock from shore. To top it off, Owen registered the mechanical design as part of a home-operated service entity, Ruby Access Systems, LLC. And since the HOA had rerouted the community kayak path to rely on launching from the shore directly behind his dock, they now faced a sudden problem, one that could only be resolved with his cooperation. He sent them an official service agreement. If they wanted the drawbridge lowered for community kayak access or water inspections, they'd have to request it through Ruby Access Systems with 48 hours notice and pay a $500 usage and access fee per event to cover equipment handling and shoreline maintenance. It wasn't vengeance for the sake of ego. It was structure, order, logic. He wasn't breaking a single law. In fact, everything he was doing stood on firmer legal ground than any move the HOA had made in the past 6 months. By trying to cut him out, they had unintentionally made themselves dependent on the very thing they tried to destroy. And Owen? He finally slept through the night, not because the battle was over, but because he'd reclaimed the wheel. The first sign that Owen's plan had worked wasn't a phone call or a letter. It was silence. No more threats. No more compliance notices. For nearly 2 weeks, the HOA board said nothing. But beneath that silence, something was brewing. Owen knew the signs. He'd seen them before in negotiation rooms and command centers. When people in power realize they've boxed themselves in, the first thing they do is retreat. The second, lash out. The storm hit at the next HOA general meeting. Robert Crane, red in the face, stood at the front of the clubhouse community room, holding up photos of Owen's drawbridge, waving them like evidence in a trial. "This is obstruction. This is sabotage," he barked. "One man is holding this neighborhood hostage." Sheila Marks, trying to regain composure, chimed in with a more performative gasp. "It's a safety issue. He's turned his dock into a fortress." Owen didn't rise to the bait. When it was his turn to speak, he walked to the front calmly, carrying a thick binder filled with permits, land surveys, emails, and correspondence from both county and state agencies. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The dock is on my deeded property," he said plainly. "The drawbridge was installed with full state approval. The crank system is certified under Florida residential marine modifications. As for the service fee, your own redevelopment plan requires continued shoreline access for kayak launch zones. And per your own filings, the HOA designated my segment of the shoreline as the only ADA accessible entry point after regrading the western path." He opened the binder and turned it around for the crowd to see. "If you attempt to bypass my dock, you'll be violating ADA regulations and 2 county safety codes regarding ramp gradients and emergency access. That's not my threat. It's the law." The room was silent. A few homeowners shifted in their seats. One man in the back, a retired firefighter Owen had spoken with once at the mailbox, nodded slowly. Robert's mouth opened, then shut. Sheila stared down at the table. Over the next month, things moved fast. The HOA's lawyer quietly confirmed everything Owen said. The board couldn't block his drawbridge. They couldn't legally install an alternate path without a full permit process, which would take over a year and potentially cost the HOA 6 figures in shoreline reinforcement. Faced with a legal quagmire and a growing wave of homeowner frustration, the board relented. By the end of the quarter, a formal agreement was drafted and signed. Owens LLC, Ruby Access Systems, was awarded a seasonal operations contract by the HOA for drawbridge coordination and shoreline compliance. The HOA would pay $2,000 per month during the active season, plus maintenance fees as needed. Robert resigned first, citing personal reasons. Sheila followed 2 weeks later, after a recall petition collected enough signatures to force her out. And Owen? Owen took Ruby out every Sunday, just as he'd always planned. The drawbridge lowered with a smooth whir of gears, then rose again as the tide shifted behind him. Neighbors waved now, some even apologized. A few asked him quietly how he'd done it, but Owen didn't talk much about the fight. He didn't need to. He had his dock. He had his peace, and the system that tried to sink him now paid him to stay afloat. Justice didn't just arrive. It docked, signed a contract, and cut a check.